The great hall was not a ballroom. It was a velvet-lined cage for the Soul Court's deadliest predators. The air was suffocating, a nauseating mix of expensive perfume and the copper tang of fear, barely masked by the scent of frost and mulled wine. From the safety of a shadowed alcove, Ondine pressed her gloved hands together until the knuckles turned white, the heavy fabric barely containing the volatile heat pulsing beneath her skin. She was an anomaly in this frozen world of ageless perfection, a burning secret wrapped in gray wool. Here, amidst the monsters who had forgotten how to bleed, to be noticed was not a privilege. It was a death sentence. A servant passed, the rush of air in his wake carrying the scent of burning cedar from the great hearths. The warmth never reached her shadowed corner. Here, only the chill of the ancient stone remained, a constant reminder of the tomb this castle had become for so many. She traced the seared, starburst pattern of a scar through the layers of her sleeve, a phantom heat blooming beneath the fabric. The others called it a curse, a divine punishment. Lord Vesper, in his clinical reports, called it a solar affliction. She only knew it as the fire that kept everyone away, the very reason for her cloistered existence. Her gaze drifted over the attendees, the preening lords and gossiping ladies of the Soul Court, their immortality worn like a second skin, their faces smooth and unlined by the centuries. They were predators draped in finery, and tonight they were hungry. The low thrum of conversation stilled, the silence rolling through the hall like a wave. It wasn't a hush of respect. It was a freezing of the blood, a primal recognition of a greater power entering the food chain. King Theron Ashwin stood framed in the grand archway, a figure carved from winter itself. He did not walk into the room. He consumed it. The firelight seemed to shrink from him, the shadows deepening at his feet. From Ondine's vantage point, he was all sharp angles and stark contrast. Pale skin, hair the color of polished jet, and eyes that held the flat, depthless quality of a frozen lake. He wore no crown, no ostentatious robes, only a simple, black tunic that did nothing to hide the lean, coiled strength of his frame. A collective, unconscious breath was held by the entire court. Lord Hadrian Vesper materialized at the king's side, a precise and deliberate shadow. Where Theron was raw, elemental force, Vesper was polished obsidian, all smooth surfaces and cutting edges. His silver-threaded robes were immaculate, his expression a mask of detached appraisal as his gaze swept the hall. His eyes, pale and analytical, paused for a fraction of a second on her alcove. Ondine's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against its cage. She pressed herself deeper into the pillar's cold embrace, willing the shadows to swallow her whole. Vesper's mouth tightened in a barely perceptible line before he turned his attention back to the dais. He knew she was here. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. He had arranged this, her first attendance in 5 years. For observation, he claimed, a necessary part of her archival duties. It felt more like a vivisection. The king moved toward the throne, his steps utterly silent on the marble. The air he displaced was frigid, carrying a scent of ozone and distant snow. As he passed the central hearth, the towering flames sputtered and shrank, cowering from his presence. He didn't seem to notice. His boredom was a palpable force, a heavy cloak he wore with regal indifference. He sank onto the throne of carved ironwood, a study in lethal stillness, his gaze fixed on nothing. The auctioneer, a man whose forced smile didn't reach his terrified eyes, scurried to the lectern. "We begin the offerings," he announced, his voice trembling slightly. "For the enduring grace and unending reign of our sovereign, King Theron." The ritual began. A duke offered a chest of soul-forged steel. A countess presented a vial of pure starlight, shimmering with captive energy. Theron watched each offering with the same profound disinterest, his long fingers resting on the arm of his throne, still as stone. Ondine's own hands ached from the cold, from the force of her grip. This was the king they called the unfeeling, the ashen heart. For centuries, legend claimed, he had felt nothing. Not joy, not sorrow, not pain. He ruled a court of immortals who chased sensation like a drug. Yet their king remained an empty vessel. Ondine's focus narrowed on his hands. They were bare, elegant, but marred by a lattice of faint, silver scars across the knuckles, the only imperfection on his otherwise flawless person. She wondered what it would take to mark such a creature. From the royal archives, the auctioneer's voice boomed, snapping her from her thoughts. Curated by Lord Vesper himself, an offering of unique historical significance. Archivist Ondine Merrick. The name struck her like a physical blow. Air abandoned her lungs. Every head in the hall turned, 100 pairs of predatory eyes searching, seeking. Lord Vesper's gaze found her, cool and expectant. A trap. This was the purpose of the evening. She was the offering. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin feeling tight and cold. The murmurings started, whispers slithering through the crowd. The untouchable. The scourge marked. Vesper's pet. Her legs refused to move, rooted to the floor by sheer, suffocating terror. A guard stepped toward her alcove, his expression impassive. He gestured toward the dais. There was no escape. Every step from the shadows into the light was a lifetime. The warmth from the hearths finally hit her, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like a violation, stripping away her layers of protective darkness. The whispers died as she came into full view, replaced by a wave of sharp, indrawn breaths. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the intricate patterns of the marble, counting the veins in the stone to keep herself from shattering. She could feel their stares on her gown, on her gloves, on the high collar, hiding the worst of the scars that climbed her neck. They weren't looking at her with ridicule. It was something else. Awe, fear, the reverence one gives to a beautiful, deadly thing. She finally dared to lift her head, her gaze meeting the king's for the first time. The emptiness in his eyes was gone. In its place was a flicker of something sharp, an unnerving, focused intensity. He was looking not at her, but through her, as if he could see the fire raging beneath her skin. Then movement, a flash of silver from the crowd to her right. It wasn't the slow, deliberate motion of a courtier. It was fast, serpentine, and silent. A man, his face a bland mask of service, lunged from behind a tapestry, a thin, wicked-looking blade in his hand. The stiletto's tip was aimed directly at her heart. There was no time to scream, no time to even breathe. But Theron moved. He wasn't just fast, he transcended speed. He was simply there, between her and the blade, a blur of black fabric and cold fury. A sickening, wet crunch echoed in the sudden silence as the assassin's blade sank deep into the back of the king's hand, the one he had raised to block the strike. The guards were on the attacker in an instant, a brutal, efficient swarm. But Ondine couldn't look away from the king. The assassin's dagger was embedded in his flesh, yet he didn't flinch. He simply looked down at the wound with a strange, detached curiosity. Blood, dark as garnet, welled up, dripping onto the pristine marble. A collective gasp swept the hall. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the blade free and let it clatter to the floor. He flexed his bleeding hand, watching the blood flow. Then, his eyes, burning with that new, terrifying light, met hers. Before she could react, before she could even process the horror, he reached out and took her arm. His grip was like iron. He brought his wounded hand to the sleeve, covering her forearm, and without hesitation, pressed the gaping, bloody wound directly against her. A scream tore from her throat as a blinding white light erupted from the point of contact. The scent of ozone and cooking meat filled the air, sharp and acrid. Sizzling. The sound of his flesh searing against the solar fire she kept hidden. The pain was a white-hot agony, a shared circuit of torment that shot up her arm and straight into her chest. He held her there, his face impassive, his eyes locked on the smoking, cauterized wound he was creating for himself. When he finally pulled his hand away, the bleeding had stopped. A fresh, blackened burn marred his skin, smelling of ash and lightning. He let go of her arm. The hall was utterly, deathly silent. Ondine stood trembling, the phantom heat of his touch a brand on her soul. He took a step closer, the cold radiating from him a stark contrast to the fire he'd just invoked. He lifted his uninjured hand, his fingers tracing the air just inches from her cheek. She could feel the heat of her own skin reaching for him, a desperate, damning energy. Smoke, thin and gray, began to rise from her face where his proximity alone was enough to burn the air. His fingertips finally made contact, grazing her jawline. The touch was impossibly gentle, a whisper against a wildfire. The skin beneath his touch didn't just smoke, it sizzled. He leaned in, his voice a low, rough sound meant only for her, a sound that held the weight of 1,000 barren years. Finally, he breathed, the words ghosting across her lips. "I feel something." The words hung in the space between them, heavier than the cold stone of the hall, more real than the phantom pain still screaming up her arm. "I feel something." Ondine's breath hitched, trapped in her lungs. Her mind, a frantic animal in a cage, could not process the sight of him. The king, his face a mask of rapt concentration, his uninjured fingers still pressed against her jawline as her own skin hissed and smoked beneath his touch. The gentle pressure was an obscenity against the violence of the act. A tremor started in her knees, a deep, cellular shudder that had nothing to do with the cold. She couldn't pull away. It was as if his voice, that low, gravelly pronouncement, had anchored her to the floor. The universe had collapsed to this single, searing point of contact. His eyes, dark and ancient, weren't looking at her, but through her, as if she were a window to a landscape he hadn't seen in centuries. He felt something, and she felt everything. The fire, the fear, the nauseating scent of her own burning flesh, and a terrifying, inexplicable stillness that settled deep in her core, watching him. He finally drew his hand back, the spell breaking. The air that rushed into the space between them felt like an arctic wind. Ondine stumbled back a step, then another, her hand flying to her cheek. The skin was tender, blistered, the pain a sharp, angry throb. He watched her retreat, his expression unreadable. He flexed the fingers of his burned hand, the blackened flesh cracking slightly. He didn't seem to notice. The guards, who had been frozen like statues, shifted uneasily, the soft scrape of their armor echoing in the profound silence. Without turning to look at them, Theron spoke, his voice returning to the flat, commanding tone of a king. "Leave us." The command was absolute. There was no hesitation. The heavy, rhythmic tread of armored boots receded down the corridor, leaving Ondine alone with the man who had just branded himself with her touch. The sudden emptiness of the hall amplified every sound. The frantic beat of her own heart, the whisper of the drafts that snaked along the flagstones, the faint, wet crackle of the burn on his hand. He turned his gaze fully upon her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold command in their depths. It was not kindness. It was a raw, unnerving hunger, not for food or for power, but for the very sensation she radiated like a plague. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request. He turned and began to move down the corridor, his long, dark coat swirling around his ankles. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. Ondine's feet felt like lead, but they moved, one in front of the other, compelled by a fear that was rapidly being contaminated by a morbid curiosity. She kept a careful distance, the heat from her own body a constant, humming reminder of the danger. The air around her was always a few degrees warmer, a personal climate of latent destruction. He led her away from the grand halls and throne room, into a wing of the castle that felt older, quieter. The tapestries here were faded, depicting hunts and coronations from forgotten dynasties. The air grew thick with the scent of dust and time, a smell she knew intimately from her life in the archives. He stopped before a set of towering doors, carved from a wood so dark it seemed to drink the light from the sconces. He pushed one open with his uninjured hand. It swung inward without a sound, revealing the source of the scent. A library. It wasn't just a room with books. It It was a cathedral built in their honor. Shelves soared 3 stories high, disappearing into the vaulted darkness above. Ladders on brass rails clung to the walls, promising access to vertiginous heights. A circular mezzanine, railed with intricate ironwork, ran around the second level. In the center of the room, a massive table of polished obsidian reflected the dim light from a single, low-hanging candelabra. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of moonlight filtering through a high, arched window. It was a place of profound silence, a sanctuary of forgotten words. Ondine, the archivist, felt a pang of something akin to reverence, an emotion so out of place with her terror that it made her feel dizzy. Theron walked to the center of the room, the sound of his boots unnaturally loud on the marble floor. He ran his burned hand along the cold surface of the obsidian table, leaving a faint, ashen smear. He seemed to be drawing strength from the silence, from the weight of the history surrounding them. Ondine remained by the door, a threshold she was terrified to cross. "You have scars," he stated, his back still to her. His voice was different in here, the echoes softer, absorbed by the paper and leather. "Tell me about them." The question was so bizarre, so disconnected from the violence of their last encounter, that she could only stare at his silhouette. "What?" The word was a dry whisper. He turned to face her, his eyes catching the candlelight. "On your arm, the one below the elbow. A pale line, shaped like a crescent moon." She instinctively glanced down at her left forearm. He was right. A silvery scar, barely visible, curved just below her elbow. A childhood memory, foolish and mundane. "I fell from a tree, a broken branch, when I was 10. 10, he repeated, the words sounding alien on his tongue, as if he were trying to recall the concept. He took a step toward her, then another. Ondine backed away until her shoulders hit the solid wood of the door. There was nowhere left to go. He stopped just out of arm's reach, the dangerous space between them charged and humming. "It must have hurt," he said, his gaze fixed on the faint scar. "You would have cried. The sharp sting of the cut, the deeper ache in the bone. Your mother would have cleaned it, the antiseptic burning in the open wound. You would have felt the needle as she stitched it closed. You felt all of that." He wasn't asking. He was cataloging, listing sensations with a clinical, almost academic detachment that was far more disturbing than any rage. Each word painted a picture of a pain he could seemingly only understand in theory. I suppose," she stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Show me," he commanded softly. A cold dread washed over her. "No." His expression didn't change, but the intensity in his eyes deepened. "I am not asking." Slowly, her limbs trembling with a mixture of defiance and terror, she held out her left arm. The sleeve of her simple gray dress fell back, exposing the pale skin, the delicate, silvery crescent of the scar. He closed the distance between them. The cold radiating from him was a physical presence, making the hairs on her arm stand on end. He lifted his right hand, the one that was unburned but no less dangerous. His fingers hovered over her skin, and she could feel the air itself begin to sizzle, the ozone smell returning, sharp and clean. She flinched, steeling herself for the agony. "Stay still," he murmured. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to travel directly through her bones. He lowered his hand. The tip of his index finger touched the very center of the old scar. Fire. White, blinding fire erupted not just on her skin, but deep inside the memory itself. It was a bizarre, layered agony. The new, searing pain of the burn, and a ghostly echo of the old pain. The fall, the sharp branch, the fear of a child. She gasped, a strangled sound, her muscles locking as she fought the instinct to rip her arm away. But she couldn't. She could only watch, mesmerized in her horror, as his fingertip began to blister. The skin turned white, then red, then a dark, angry purple. A tiny wisp of smoke curled up from the point of contact, carrying the smell of his cooking flesh. And he did not pull away. He held his finger there, pressing down with steady, deliberate pressure. His jaw was tight, a muscle twitching near his temple. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was a harsh, ragged sound in the silent library. He looked like a man in the throes of some terrible ecstasy, a martyr embracing the flames. The sight was so profoundly wrong, so deeply unsettling, that Ondine felt her own pain recede, overshadowed by the sheer force of his will. He was chasing the sensation, holding on to it, drinking it in like a man dying of thirst. When he finally lifted his finger, a perfect circular burn, weeping and raw, marked the tip. On her own arm, the old, silvery scar was now encircled by a fresh, red brand. He looked from her arm to his own ruined fingertip, a strange, grimly satisfied light in his eyes. "Yes," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "That's it." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the cold mask of the king was gone, replaced by something raw and exposed. "You're the first thing that has hurt me in 500 years. The confession landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. 500 years. Ondine stared at him, the blister on her arm, the seared flesh of his hand, the weeping burn on his fingertip all snapping into a terrifying new focus. This wasn't cruelty. It was a kind of desperate medicine. He was using her curse to feel. The thought was so monstrous it stole the air from her lungs. She was his antidote. She was his poison. She was his only link to a world of sensation he had been locked out of for half a millennium. The horror of her situation had just deepened into a chasm. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a remedy. And remedies, once they have served their purpose, are often discarded. The days that followed blurred into a surreal, horrifying routine. He called them resistance sessions, a sterile, clinical name for what felt like methodical torture. They took place not in the library, but in the highest room of the North Tower, a circular chamber with narrow, arrow-slit windows that looked out over the desolate, windswept moors. The room was bare, save for 2 simple wooden chairs and a small table. It felt like an interrogation chamber or a monastic cell. Here, away from the prying eyes and ears of the court, the King of Ashwin systematically explored the boundaries of his own endurance and her devastating touch. He would instruct her to place her hand on his arm, and they would both watch as his skin blistered and smoked. He would time it with an ancient sandglass on the table, his voice a low monotone as he narrated the sensations. A tingling heat. It deepens now like a hot wire under the skin. The smell is acrid, sharp. He spoke as if he were a scientist observing a chemical reaction, and in a way he was. The subject was himself. The catalyst was her. Ondine would sit there, her own hand burning in sympathy, her stomach churning, forced to be a participant in his self-destruction. Sometimes she would cry silently, the tears tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks. He never acknowledged them. He was lost in his own world, a world of newfound agony that was, for him, a kind of rebirth. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the thick glass of the windows, he pushed the limits further than ever before. He took her hand, not by the fingers, but lacing his own through hers, pressing their palms together. The contact was immediate and devastating. A wave of heat so intense it felt like she'd plunged her arm into a forge. A scream caught in her throat, and she tried to pull back, but his grip was iron. "Don't," he commanded, his voice strained, tight with effort. The smell of burning was overwhelming. She could feel her own skin blistering, sticking to his. The pain was a living thing, a shared nerve that connected them, pulsing with a hideous, synchronized rhythm. His face was pale, beaded with sweat in the flickering lamplight. His eyes were squeezed shut, his lips a thin white line. For the first time, she saw the true cost of what he was doing. This wasn't a detached experiment. This was a battle. "Why?" she finally gasped out, the word torn from her. "Why are you doing this?" His eyes snapped open, and they were black pools of ancient suffering. The king was gone. The scientist was gone. All that was left was the man. "Because I have to," he ground out, his knuckles white where he gripped her hand. "Because for 600 years, I have felt nothing." Nothing. The words came out in a torrent. a confession held back for centuries. This castle, the stone is neither cold nor warm. The finest wine tastes of ash. The silken sheets on my bed feel like sand. I have walked through fire and felt no heat. I have stood on the highest battlements in a winter gale and felt no cold. My body is a prison, a tomb of dead nerves. He took a ragged breath, the sound of it raw and broken. When my father died, I felt no grief. When they placed this crown on my head, I felt no pride. I have known women, taken heirs, ruled a kingdom, all of it behind a wall of nothing. A silent, gray, eternal numbness. He finally let go. Their hands separated with a soft, sickening sound like tearing wet cloth. Ondine cradled her arm, her palm a mess of weeping burns. He held his own hand up, a mangled, blackened thing, and stared at it with a kind of desperate awe. "And then you," he whispered, his gaze lifting to meet hers. It was stripped of all artifice, all command. It was the gaze of a drowning man who has just found something to cling to. "Your touch. It is the only real thing I have felt since I was a mortal man. The pain is exquisite. It is a fire that burns away the gray. It proves that I am still here, that I have not yet become a ghost." The air in the room was thick with his confession, with the smell of their shared wounds. Ondine looked at him, at the sweat on his brow, the tremor in his ruined hand, the profound, aching loneliness in his eyes. And the fear that had been her constant companion for weeks was suddenly, terrifyingly, joined by something else. A sliver of understanding. A terrible, unwelcome seed of pity. He was a monster, yes, but his monstrosity was a cage. And she, with her own curse, held the only key. A dangerous intimacy began to bloom in that high, lonely room, cultivated in pain and silence. She learned to read the minute shifts in his expression, the tightening of his jaw that meant the sensation was reaching its peak, the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed the effort of his control. She began to see the man, Theron, separate from the king. He, in turn, began to see her. He would bring her books in the tower, rare manuscripts he thought she would appreciate. He asked her about her life before she was brought to the castle, listening with an unnerving stillness as she spoke of her quiet days in the provincial archives, the scent of old paper her only companion. They were two lonely creatures, locked in a bizarre symbiosis. He needed her pain to feel alive. And she was beginning to need his need. The realization was a cold dread in the pit of her stomach. She was growing accustomed to the fire. Her duties as an archivist were a welcome respite. Theron had given her free reign of the royal library, a kingdom of her own within his. She spent her days cataloging crumbling scrolls, repairing the spines of ancient books, the familiar, methodical work of balm to her frayed nerves. She found a strange comfort in the order, in the quiet companionship of the dead. Callie, the young, blind maid, would bring her meals there. The girl moved with a preternatural grace, her bare feet silent on the marble floors, her sightless eyes seeming to see more than most. She never spoke of the king, or of the rumors that Ondine knew must be snaking through the castle's servant quarters. But her gentle presence was a comfort, a small link to a world outside the intense, claustrophobic bubble Ondine inhabited with Theron. One afternoon, as Ondine was carefully transcribing a fragment of a royal decree from the First Dynasty, the library doors opened. She expected Callie, or perhaps even Theron. But the man who stepped inside was Lord Hadrian Vesper. He moved with a quiet confidence, his dark, scholarly robes making no sound. He surveyed the library not with the reverence of a scholar, but with the appraising eye of a collector. His gaze fell upon Ondine, and his lips curved into a thin, bloodless smile. It did not reach his eyes. "Miss Merrick," he said, his voice smooth and precise. "I trust you are finding your accommodations stimulating." Ondine rose slowly from her stool, her heart beginning a low, heavy thrum against her ribs. She had not seen Vesper since the day she arrived, but she had felt his influence, a cold shadow at the edge of her awareness. "Lord Vesper, the king has taken a keen interest in you," he continued, strolling towards her table. He picked up a small, leather-bound volume, running a finger along the gold leaf tooling. A very physical interest. He has always been a man of unique appetites. The veiled insinuation made her skin crawl. His Majesty's motivations are his own. Indeed, Vesper said, placing the book down with a soft thud. And my motivations are for the stability of this kingdom. A stability which your presence has, shall we say, complicated. He reached inside his robes, his movements calm and deliberate. He produced a rolled parchment, tied with a simple black ribbon. The king is a creature of deep feeling, buried under centuries of apathy. You have unearthed something in him, but feelings, Miss Merrick, can be a liability for a ruler. They can be manipulated. He placed the parchment on the table between them, pushing it towards her. The black ribbon felt like a funeral sash. Ondine stared at it, a sense of profound dread tightening its coils around her chest. "What is this?" "A formality," Vesper said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A contingency plan drafted some weeks ago when the nature of your condition became clear. For the protection of the king and the realm. All it required was a signature." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the roll. The parchment felt cold, brittle. She untied the ribbon. It slithered onto the table like a dead snake. She unrolled the document. It was an official decree, written in the meticulous, elegant script of a royal scribe. Her eyes scanned the dense text, catching words that leapt out at her like flames. Asterisk manifest danger. Uncontrolled element. Threat to the royal person. Cleansing by fire. Asterisk, it was an execution order. Her execution order. A death sentence, detailed with cold, bureaucratic precision. And then she saw it. At the bottom of the page, above the affixed royal seal, was the signature. A bold, jagged script she had come to recognize from the marginalia in the library's oldest books. A signature she had seen him use to sign royal edicts just days before. Theron Ashwin. The world tilted. The towering shelves of the library seemed to lean inward, the air growing thin and sharp. The quiet sanctuary became a tomb. Every session in the tower, every shared moment of pain, every whispered confession replayed in her mind, now tainted, twisted into a grotesque lie. The intimacy, the vulnerability, his desperate need to feel. Had it all been a performance? A monstrous, calculated manipulation to gain her trust, to keep her compliant until the moment was right? Vesper's calm, rational voice cut through the roaring in her ears. "He signed it the day after you arrived," he said, his tone devoid of malice, a simple statement of fact. "Before he ever touched you. Pragmatism, you see, it always wins over passion in the end. He feels, yes, thanks to you, but he still thinks like a king." The paper was no longer paper. It was a shard of ice in her fingers, then a sheet of flame. The ink of Theron's name bled into her vision, a black wound on the pristine vellum. Every nerve in her body screamed a silent, echoing betrayal. Vesper's voice was a distant drone, the hum of an insect, meaningless against the hurricane tearing through her. Pragmatism. He used the word like a shield, a justification for a cruelty so profound it stole the breath from her lungs. She had been a contingency plan, a curiosity to be studied, a tool to be used, and a threat to be neutralized from the very beginning. The decree fluttered from her numb fingers, landing softly on the Aubusson rug, an innocent white square that held the truth of a monstrous lie. The world didn't just tilt, it fractured, the pieces of her sanity skittering into the dark corners of the library. "He could not risk what you are," Vesper continued, his voice regaining its clarity as the roaring in her ears subsided to a painful thrum. He took a step closer, not to her, but towards a shadowed alcove she'd never noticed, hidden behind a rotating globe of the celestial spheres. "He is a creature of immense feeling, yes. You unlocked that. But his ancestors locked it away for a reason. Come." It was not a request. He gestured, and her feet, disconnected from her will, followed. He ran a hand along a row of identical, leather-bound tomes, finally pulling one free. It was older than the others, the leather cracked, the spine stamped not with a title, but with an alchemical symbol for torment. He opened it on a nearby lectern. The pages were brittle, filled with a spidery, frantic script. She saw diagrams of the human nervous system, notes on metallurgy, on the conductive properties of silver and gold. And she saw one word, repeated over and over, circled in faded red ink. Anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. A clinical, cold word for a curse. The Ashwin malady, Vesper explained, his finger tracing a lineage chart. For 5 generations, they have been born numb, a congenital deadening of the nerves. They sought a cure in alchemy, in pain. They believed a great enough shock to the system could restart the heart's engine. His finger stopped on Theron's name, and next to it, a notation from a physician dated 30 years prior. Asterisk subject exhibits extreme tolerance to stimuli. Only the most severe applications yield any response. Recommend discontinuation of treatment. The soul cannot be cauterized back to life. Asterisk. He wasn't just a masochist, Ondine, Vesper said, his voice a low, clinical whisper. He was a desperate man chasing a ghost. And then you arrived. The ultimate stimulus. A living lightning rod. He felt more with one touch from you than his ancestors felt in a lifetime of self-inflicted agony. But a drug that potent, it is an addiction, and a king cannot afford such an addiction. The decree was his failsafe, his method of weaning himself off, should your dosage become too high. He closed the book, the puff of dust smelling of decay and failure. He would have used you until you were no longer convenient, and then he would have disposed of you, convincing himself it was for the good of the kingdom. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of old paper and Vesper's suffocating logic. A cold rage, clean and sharp as glass, began to crystallize in her chest. They had both treated her as a problem to be solved, a specimen to be analyzed and contained. The gloves on her hands suddenly felt like a cage, the veil a shroud. They were instruments of their control, not her protection. The heavy oak doors to the library burst inward, slamming against the stone walls with a crack of thunder. Theron stood framed in the doorway, his chest heaving, his silver eyes wild and scanning the cavernous room. He was not the composed king or the vulnerable man from the tower. This was something else, a predator who had lost its quarry. His eyes found her, and a wave of raw, desperate relief washed over his features, so potent she felt it across the room. Then his gaze flickered to Vesper, to the ancient logbook on the lectern, and his face hardened into a mask of fury and dread. "Hadrian," he growled, the name a curse on his tongue. "Step away from her." "I am merely providing Miss Merrick with the context she deserves," Vesper said, his calm a stark contrast to Theron's storm. He placed himself subtly between them, a scholar defending his discovery. The full picture of her employment. Theron took a step into the room, his movements coiled with a dangerous energy. "What you have done is an act of treason. What I have done is risk management," Vesper countered smoothly. "You're compromised. She makes you reckless. A king cannot be reckless. I am protecting the crown. From you." Their words became a volley, a battle of accusations and justifications that flew over her head. Betrayal, duty, fear, love. The words were meaningless noise. She looked at Theron, at the raw agony in his eyes, the terror of being exposed. She saw the man who had cried out her name in the darkness, who had traced the veins on her wrist as if they were a sacred map. And she saw the jagged signature on her own death warrant. Then she looked at Vesper, his face a mask of pragmatic concern. She saw the man who offered a cage of cold, hard facts, a life where power would be managed, studied, and ultimately leashed. Two sides of the same coin, both wanting to define her, to own her condition. A hum started in her bones, a low thrum of energy that had been suppressed for a lifetime. She had been the untouchable, the archivist, the anomaly. But in this room, caught between the king who craved her touch and the courtier who feared it, she finally understood. She was not a condition. She was a choice. Her choice. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hands. The room fell silent. Theron and Vesper both stopped, their gazes locking onto her gloved fingers. With the focused precision of her archivist training, she began to unfasten the tiny pearl button at her left wrist. The fabric parted. The leather was soft against her skin, a familiar prison. She slid the glove off, finger by finger, the movement an agonizingly slow act of rebellion. The air in the library shifted. The scent of ozone, faint at first, began to prickle the air. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shrink back, repelled by a light only they could see. She let the glove fall to the floor. Then she reached for the other. "Ondine, don't," Theron breathed, his voice tight with a mixture of terror and a terrible, magnetic desire. Vesper took a half step back, his composure finally cracking. His hand went to his breast pocket. "This is precisely what I feared. An uncontrolled element." She pulled a second glove off. Her bare hands felt alien in the open air, a current humming just beneath the skin. A pale, ethereal luminescence, like moonlight trapped under ice, began to emanate from her palms. Lastly, she reached up to her face, her fingers finding the edge of her veil. She untied the silk ribbon and pulled it away. The oppressive fabric came free, and for the first time in this castle, she felt the air of the room on her cheeks. She met Theron's gaze, unveiled and unadorned. "Stop this foolishness, girl," Vesper snapped, his fear curdling into anger. He lunged forward, not at her, but towards the lectern. He seized a long, vicious-looking silver letter opener, its point gleaming in the lamplight. "You will be contained." He moved to grab her arm. She didn't flinch. She simply raised her hand, palm open. The moment his fingers touched hers, the world erupted. It was not a shock she sent out, but a current she received. A torrent of Vesper's entire being flooded her. Decades of cold ambition, of lonely intellectual pride, of clinical detachment, of a deep-seated fear of anything that could not be categorized and controlled. She felt his resentment of Theron's power, his calculated plan to use her to expose the king's weakness and seize influence. It was a tidal wave of sterile, gray emotion, and it was excruciating. Vesper screamed. It was not a sound of pain, but of overload. The silver letter opener clattered to the floor. He convulsed, stumbling backward